Somewhere inside a dilution refrigerator cooled to temperatures colder than deep space, a chip no larger than a thumbnail is running a computation that requires more physical components to protect a single useful answer than most classical processors use to run an entire operating system. That gap between the raw fragile quantum state and the reliable logical unit capable of finishing a calculation is where the entire commercial quantum computing industry has placed one of two incompatible wagers. One side is piling up physical qubits as fast as fabrication allows, betting that engineering refinement will eventually quiet the noise on a machine already built at scale. The other side is holding qubit counts deliberately lower, pouring the same engineering budget into error correction, and betting that a machine capable of holding a quantum state long enough to complete something useful arrives before the scale-first approach can clean itself up. The evidence on which of these two paths is actually closer to paying off has shifted meaningfully in the past year, and what follows prices where the odds now sit. The two wagers are distinct and in genuine tension. Bet A accumulates raw physical qubits now, absorbs the noise as an engineering problem to be managed later, and trusts that the first mover at large scale will have enough runway to survive the transition when error correction finally matures. Bet B holds qubit counts lower, invests in demonstrating fault-tolerant logical qubits before scaling, and accepts slower headline numbers in exchange for machines that can actually carry a computation to completion. Four escalating pieces of evidence weigh these bets. One conceded loss prices the line honestly, and the specific catalysts that would swing the odds in either direction close the analysis. Start with a metric the scale-first programs lead on most visibly: raw physical qubit count. The programs running the largest arrays, including the publicly documented roadmaps from major United States hardware vendors, and several Chinese national programs operating under significant state resource backing, have built machines with qubit counts that the quality first camp cannot currently match on headline numbers. That lead is real. On a strict count of physical qubits, the quality first bet loses, and the analysis prices that loss flat without softening it. Google's Willow chip carries far fewer physical qubits than the largest competing processors, and if the race were decided by physical qubit totals today, the quality first path does not win. It is worth sitting with that concession rather than immediately winning it back, because the scale-first programs have genuine engineering momentum and fabrication depth that should not be dismissed by anyone pricing this race honestly. The question the count metric cannot answer, however, is what those physical qubits are actually doing. A physical qubit is a quantum state that decays. It interacts with its environment, accumulates errors, and loses the information it was supposed to carry at a rate that scales with both time and the number of neighboring qubits contributing noise. A 2-qubit gate error rate above roughly 1% by widely cited theoretical estimates means that adding more qubits to a system amplifies errors faster than it adds computational power. Below that threshold, the dynamic reverses. Every honest roadmap from the major scale-first programs distinguishes between its physical qubit milestones and what it calls utility scale or error-corrected operation, which is an implicit acknowledgement that these are two different events separated by a significant engineering gap. No independent team has demonstrated a commercially relevant computation on a large, noisy physical qubit machine that could not be simulated on classical hardware. And the scale-first program's own public framing concedes this distinction. That moves the line toward the quality-first bet on the question of which milestone actually matters. Consider what the quality-first camp did differently and what it produced. Google's research group published a result in late 2024 in a peer-reviewed journal describing a chip operating in what is called the below-threshold regime. Error rates that decrease as the size of the error-correcting code increases rather than increasing, which is the specific property that makes fault-tolerant scaling possible. Below threshold, adding more physical qubits reduces errors. Above threshold, adding more qubits makes things worse. The Willow result is the most specific public evidence that any program has demonstrated this property on superconducting hardware. The paper has been peer-reviewed. The primary result has not been publicly disputed on its technical merits, and the theoretical framework it draws on, a family of error. Correcting codes with established mathematical foundations provides external plausibility that does not depend on trusting a single vendor's claims. The quality-first camp crossed a binary milestone the scale-first camp has not yet reached on comparable hardware, and that asymmetry is what moves the line meaningfully rather than marginally. The rebuttal deserves equal precision, though. Demonstrating below-threshold error correction on a small grid of physical qubits under controlled laboratory conditions is not the same thing as a scalable architecture for a useful machine. The overhead required to assemble one logical qubit from physical ones, with figures from the group's own published work suggesting many dozens to potentially hundreds of physical qubits per logical qubit, depending on the target error rate and connectivity structure, means that the engineering distance between the Willow demonstration and a machine running a commercially valuable algorithm with enough logical qubits to matter is still enormous. The analogy that makes this concrete: a physical qubit is something like a single unreliable messenger carrying information through a city with no landmarks, prone to getting lost, distracted, or corrupted by the environment. A logical qubit is what emerges when you send the same information through dozens of overlapping redundant channels, cross-check the arrivals, and reconstruct the original from the consensus. The message gets through reliably, but you have consumed the entire courier network for one delivery. Scaling a fault-tolerant quantum computer means running that redundant network for thousands of deliveries simultaneously, which is why the overhead ratio between physical and logical qubits is not a footnote, but the central economic constraint of the whole enterprise. Neither bet has resolved it. The line after these two weighings, meaningfully toward the quality first bet on the specific technical question of which side has crossed the threshold that governs whether scaling helps or hurts, but with genuine uncertainty remaining on the question of how far that threshold crossing is from a useful machine. The race is not over. The Chinese national programs introduce a third layer of evidence that the two-bet frame needs to price honestly. Several of these programs are operating with significant state resource backing and a mandate to develop domestic quantum hardware capability at scale. The photonic sampling demonstrations from the University of Science and Technology of China group have received international scientific attention, though these are results in a specialized modality, and several appeared initially as preprints rather than peer-reviewed publications in the style of the Willow paper. They are not superconducting scale demonstrations with published 2-qubit gate error benchmarks at a comparable level, and treating them as equivalent evidence for the scale first bet would overstate the case. What is notable is that some Chinese programs appear to be pursuing photonic and alternative hardware modalities in parallel with superconducting qubit development, which may reflect an internal recognition that raw superconducting scale alone does not guarantee the transition to error-corrected operation. The constraint that came from partial separation from certain Western fabrication ecosystems redirected some engineering investment toward qubit count on superconducting hardware. The dimension where independent progress was most achievable, but the most technically original results from Chinese quantum research have arguably emerged from the photonic track, which operated under different constraints and produced different engineering priorities. That distinction slightly favors the quality first argument, not because the Chinese scale first work is irrelevant, but because the programs closest to demonstrated below threshold operation are the ones that treated noise control as a primary design constraint rather than a problem to engineer around later. Here's where the decisive weighing prices the full picture. The below threshold property is the binary that governs the entire race because it determines whether the scaling strategy works at all. Above threshold, every additional physical qubit added to a large array makes the system harder to compute with reliably. Below threshold, additional qubits suppress errors. The scale first bet only pays off if those machines can reach below threshold at large scale. The quality first bet has demonstrated below threshold at small scale. The question the odds are now pricing is which gap closes faster: the quality first camp's gap between demonstrated threshold crossing and sufficient logical qubit counts for a useful algorithm, or the scale first camp's gap between its current large noisy arrays and the below threshold error rates that would let its scale advantage convert into computational power. On the evidence available through mid-2025, those are not symmetric gaps. One side has crossed the threshold and needs to scale the result. The other side needs to cross the threshold before its scale becomes useful. Pricing them as equivalent achievements would itself be an analytical error. The hedge has 3 points. First, the Willow result, while peer-reviewed, has not been independently reproduced by a separate research group on comparable hardware. A single laboratory's demonstration of below threshold operation is one data point, and the history of quantum computing research includes several results that proved harder to replicate at scale than the original demonstration implied. Independent confirmation would transform this from a vendor-adjacent claim into an established engineering capability. The absence of that confirmation is a real uncertainty that the odds must price. Second, the logical qubit overhead problem remains open. Demonstrating below threshold error rates on a small grid does not resolve how many physical qubits will ultimately be required per logical qubit for a target computation of commercial value. Theoretical estimates span a wide range depending on code choice, connectivity architecture, and target error rate, and if the overhead turns out toward the higher end of current projections, the timeline to a useful machine on the quality first path extends considerably. Third, coherence time across large arrays is a documented unsolved constraint. A qubit's coherence time, the window during which it holds a quantum state before environmental noise collapses it into classical randomness, runs on current superconducting hardware in the range of microseconds to low milliseconds. Executing an error-corrected algorithm requires many sequential gate operations, each consuming a slice of that window. Running out of coherence time mid-computation does not produce an approximate answer. It produces no answer. Whether the below-threshold property demonstrated on a small grid holds as the array scales to the size required for meaningful logical qubit counts is an open experimental question. The synthesis, the quality first bet, leads on the most important specific technical milestone, but the distance between that milestone and commercial utility is large enough, and the failure modes credible enough, that the race remains genuinely open. Two specific catalysts would move the line next, and both deserve more than a sentence. If an independent research group outside Google, whether a domestic competitor, a Chinese superconducting program, or an academic laboratory, demonstrates below-threshold error correction on a grid of comparable or larger size, the line shifts sharply toward the quality first bet. That result would convert the Willow demonstration from a single-team claim into a reproducible architectural property, which is the evidentiary step that separates interesting physics from engineering infrastructure. The scale-first camp's strongest remaining argument that the Willow result may be a controlled demonstration rather than a generalizable architecture collapses if independent reproduction holds its scale. Conversely, if below-threshold performance fails to persist as grid size increases in reproduction attempts, the line moves back toward neutral because it would suggest the threshold crossing is sensitive to the specific conditions of a small, carefully engineered array rather than a robust property of the code and hardware class. That outcome would substantially reprice the quality first bet downward. The second catalyst runs the other direction. If any scale-first program produces a publicly verifiable demonstration of a practically useful computation on a large noisy physical qubit machine, a result that resists classical simulation, and produces an output with genuine commercial relevance, the odds shift sharply toward bet A. This would constitute evidence that error mitigation techniques and classical post-processing can bridge the threshold gap without full fault tolerance, which would reprice the entire race. The significance here is not just the specific result, but what it implies about the trajectory. Every additional development cycle in which the largest physical qubit machines fail to produce a classically hard, practically useful output tightens the argument that raw scale is not sufficient and that the threshold must be crossed before utility is reachable. Absence of this result does not prove the scale-first path fails, but its continued absence is itself evidence that moves the line. On the current public record, the quality first bet holds the stronger technical position. The scale-first camp has more physical qubits and broader hardware manufacturing momentum. The quality first camp has crossed the specific threshold that governs whether scaling converts into computational power. These are not equivalent achievements on the path to a useful machine, and the constraint that shaped the quality first wager, the engineering discipline imposed by treating noise as a hard ceiling rather than a later problem, turns out to be the same constraint now pressuring the scale-first machines from below. The programs that invested in error correction architecture before qubit count are the ones that demonstrated the property that makes scaling meaningful, and that is where the odds now sit. The logical qubit, the fault-tolerant unit both bets are ultimately racing to deploy at commercial volume, remains unclaimed at scale by either side. That is the fact that keeps both roads open. The odds favor the camp that crossed the threshold. The open question for the scale-first programs is not whether larger machines can be built, but whether a larger machine can be made quiet enough, coherent enough, and error suppressed enough to join the race for the same destination, and the clock on that answer runs against a competitor that is already on the other side of the noise floor. If you had to back one of these two bets across a 10-year horizon, more qubits now and error correct later, or fewer qubits and error correct your way to utility first, which direction does the overhead math push you, and what would the logical qubit cost number have to look like for you to switch sides? Leave the analysis in the comments. If this kind of probabilistic breakdown of the quantum race is why you're here, subscribe. The next weighing is already in progress.